All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Nelson. I'm alongside with Samantha Baker, and today we will be doing our presentation on grief in families, dealing with racial inequality and oppression, with a emphasis on grief in mothers and fathers. So we're just going to open up with this quote, and it reads, "This pain has visited every Black parent who has lost a child to the obfuscating hands of racism over 4 centuries. It has also touched each and one of us who has borne witness. As Black people, we stand together." This quote is profound, and it resonates with a lot of people. It makes me think of COVID-19 and when the pandemic hit, and we started to hear those unfortunate stories of men who unfortunately lost their lives due to the hands of law enforcement as a result of their skin color. Not to say that this was not happening before, but again, I feel that it was more prominent during these times. We saw a lot of like racial injustice and so forth. As far as grief may look differently for different people, but some typical signs include depression. So that could be oversleeping, undersleeping, overeating, being fatigued. So constant feeling tired and so forth. Some guilt, as far as is there something that I could have done more of or less of? Some anger, about the situation, like why is this happening to me? Substance use. This is something that we also saw during the height and peak of COVID-19. There was a lot of fentanyl usage due to isolation, as well as just natural things that were happening in everyone's life. Changes in life perspectives. When someone goes through loss, for some people, they may not care anymore about life, or they may not have any hope or compassion, and many more. For some people, grief could look like complicated grief that we've mentioned before in our class, or prolonged grief, which is an extended period of grief. But what does that really mean for folks? I know for some people, you will never, for some people, they're not able to kind of get over a loss, right? But what does it mean and what does it look like for these mothers and these fathers who are going through these situations?
This is one of the most prominent, well-known cases that we've heard about in history before, of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who had ended up being murdered back in Mississippi. So he was from up north. He was visiting family in the South, and pretty much he was accused of whistling at a white woman across the street when he was walking on. Because of that, he was then found murdered and killed the next day. He was dragged out of bed by a group of white men, where he was beaten and tortured to a point where he was unrecognizable. Um, his mother, the time when the funeral came, she decided to have an open casket funeral because she wanted everyone to see kind of, what they did to her son. The point that she wanted to make was that, this is what they did to a 14-year-old boy for simply, supposedly, whistling at a Caucasian woman. So this was a time where racial inequality was an all-time high. There's segregation still in place. There's a lot of things that for African American people that it was just no nos to do, or you had to basically pay the consequences of, and sometimes the consequences even death for certain things. So this is a prominent example of racial inequality in America. And in today's society, there are many more Emmett Till cases that they have, and that has caught national attention as well. Many of these cases of racial inequality come to the hands of our government officials, sometimes these people in our communities, and even police officers that were meant to protect and serve our communities in general. So, what is racial inequality? So, by definition, Racial inequality is the unequal distribution of resources, power, and economic opportunity across race in a society. While the discussion of racial inequality in the United States is often focused on economic inequality, racial inequality and also manifests itself into a multitude of other ways that alone and together impact the well-being of all Americans. This includes racial disparities in wealth, education, employment, housing mobility, health, rates of incarceration, and much more. So pretty much what that looks like is, as we mentioned, it looks like discrimination and violence and oppression. Discrimination meaning far as, as far as unemployment goes, not able to get a certain job just because of the color of your skin, or not being able to get a certain employment just based upon a disability that you may have had. Violence, where we know we see in history that is more predominantly more violent cases among Black and African American people, where the rates of incarceration are predominantly higher compared to our other counterparts in society. As we see the justice system itself, there's a lot of oppression where, if you don't have the right lawyer or the right type of funds or the right type of sources, you aren't going to get really any type of feasible or good outcome for yourself when it comes to the incarceration system. Who was affected by it? Many people are affected by racial inequality, such as African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, just to name a few. But everyone, in some way, shape, or form, is affected by racial inequality, whether it's directly affected or indirectly affected in some way, shape, or form. Everyone plays a part in that.
Okay, so as Sam mentioned, oppression is one of those things that unfortunately some groups are subject to. So here we have four forms of oppression. So the first being individual, which is conscious or unconscious beliefs. Then we have interpersonal oppression, which is the unequal treatment of people in different identity groups. Again, unfortunately, this is something that we were witness to during 2020 when COVID hit. Unfortunately, the Asian American community were especially affected by this due to the uncertainty with the start of COVID-19 and its origin. Then we have systematic oppression, which is the institutional inequity that privileges some while oppressing others. We see this within the workforce. We see this just in our day to day lives. And then finally, we have cultural oppression, which is a sense of inferiority or superiority based on perceived cultural group. So again, this is just one group thinking that they are better in some way, shape, or form than another group. And again, these are things that we see on media outlets, whether that be on TV, social media, and again, just our day to day lives and within our communities. Followed by 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, was the Black Lives Matter movement, which began or in previous years, but was definitely emphasized during 2020 when the everything started going on. So the Black Lives Matter was a result of the acquittal of the murder of Trayvon Martin. This movement was aimed at eradicating white supremacy and building powerful interventions on the violence present in Black communities. Again, as we began our presentation and we spoke about Emmett Till, unfortunately, it's not just one case, it's several cases where families were unfortunately victims of inequality that resulted in one dying. So here we just have a video that we're going to show that's basically kind of summarizing our previous slides. So again, that short TED Talk video was just to summarize some of our previous slides and kind of talk about the movement and what it means, not only to like the minority community, but specifically to those who have been witness to some of the tragedies that we mentioned before. Again, some of these things aren't just limited to like Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin. There are several names that we can call out who have been affected by this, including George Floyd, Eric Garner, Jordan Neely, and Tyree Nicholas, just to name a few. And again, it's not just the fathers or the mothers, but the families who are also grieving these losses and have to bear witness to the constant anniversaries of these deaths that are taking place.
Uh, So with this slide, kind of wanted to touch base on pretty much where it all began. So the history of racial inequality and oppression stems way back into slavery days when the Europeans went to Africa and enslaved the Africans and took them to a new land to do the work needed, whether it was to tend to the land, be caregivers to children, sex slaves, and the list goes on to what their roles were when they came to this land. Blacks for a long time were not even seen as people, rather just animals or just property owned. So many people didn't even have names. They were called either by numbers or just, hey, you come over here kind of thing. They wasn't seen as a person. So there was no freedom or rights for African Americans, and that continued on for decades. In our history books, you remember one of the brave souls who was the face of change, who wanted to make a difference for his people, and that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., along with many other brave individuals who also fought for the rights of African Americans, as many of them also died fighting for this cause. There have been sit-ins, there's been protests, there's been gatherings in the hopes of making change. And grief during this period of time was at an all-time high because families were forced to be separated. Families were drawn apart, where children were forced to go one way, men were forced to go this way, women were forced to go that way. So not knowing the outcome, not knowing their futures brought grief into these families where, sometimes it was just unimaginable. And I couldn't even imagine myself, sitting into that and just being a part of that in that time where people were getting killed just based on the color of their skins. So that was a difficult time, and it shows how a lot of these mothers and fathers and families were battling such prolonged grief for such a long time as well too during this period.
All right, so that's where we come in as social workers. So what we can do, as far as everything that's going on, as far as like racial inequality, as well as supporting families who are grieving, definitely advocacy is definitely a big part, not only for ourselves, but also keeping in mind that advocating for our clients and the clients that we plan to work with is also very much important. Also research. Naturally, we all have our own biases, and kind of like preferences and things and how we handle certain situations. So providing yourself with that research, that knowledge, so you do have those effective tools to support individuals that you are working with is very much important as well. And then resources. We all know what might be helpful for us, but it's definitely helpful to know what's going to be effective for the people around you and the people that you are working with. So, kind of honing in on that case management piece is also very much important when working with our families, especially when they are grieving. And just listening. That's also a big and an important part of the grief process. Sometimes people don't want feedback. Sometimes they don't want suggestions. Sometimes they just want somebody to kind of just sit and listen to them, talk, ramble, complain, whatever the case may be. And following that session, you might not know how effective that might be to that individual. So these 4 points are definitely important, not only as social workers, but as humans as well when working with those who are grieving and going through that process is very, very much important. And then forgot to mention as well, compassion, like we mentioned in class, is also very much important because we may be dealing with clients who have not been in situations that we are familiar with. So having that compassion, wanting to learn and understand what it is that someone is going through will also be very much effective.
Okay. So what do we hope for the future? As you know, social workers in the field, and just as people as mentioned, just work with other people in the community. So one of the things that we're hoping for in the future, such as better equality, whether it be social, economic, or cultural, just fairness all around for everyone. Seeing more of that as we see today, there's a lot of unfairness that goes on. So just seeing more equality altogether, that'd be a good thing. I feel like as far as change, we're hoping to work in a more better direction. Freedom of speech, I'll say, because do we really you have to think about, we have the First Amendment, say, you have the rights to freedom of speech, but do we really have that? Because many times I feel like a lot of people are silenced once you try to speak on certain topics or certain things and certain aspects or spread truth awareness on certain things. Many times you're silenced or you're ostracized or you're kind of blackballed into a field where you're not heard of or not being heard. So working more on that as far as having more freedom of speech and more spreading awareness of what's really going on. That's part of the advocacy part. Um, Another example could be more organizations being created fighting for racial equality and oppression. And we hear things like the NAACP and certain organizations such as that, but I feel like there should be more on far as like even just a state level, whether or not to be federal, but within each state, have more organizations created to help fight for these injustices that's going on all together, and even today's society. Unity, more so people coming together and more communities coming together, less segregation and that less pointing fingers at one group and this group, just coming together as a whole, rather than everyone is being separated, kind of focusing on their own groups and cultures. Because it's African Americans itself, that's one group that's facing a racial inequality and oppression. But as we see, we have a lot of people who are migrating or immigrating to the U.S. who are also facing, a lot of this inequality and oppression as well too from other countries. So it's not necessarily just the blacks, it's per se African Americans. There are other groups as well who are also fighting. So it's coming together as a whole for that as well. Change, change within ourselves as people, change as within the government, or as mentioned, the state and federal levels as well, and change within communities, making more awareness of things that's going on. Changing of, some of the policies that are in place currently, that can benefit more for people who are in low income impoverished communities that, are the ones that are really suffering at the end of the day. And as well as mentioned, with regards to the grief, to support groups for mothers, families, and fathers and families dealing with loss and griefs. Like we have like many support groups as far as other aspects, like AA groups and anger management groups and things like that. But there's not really much support groups I feel like, or we feel like that's for mothers and families dealing with grief and loss, because many people are suffering mentally. We should see in today's society that, there are a lot more mental health cases, a lot of people more acting out, a lot of people more so outraged and doing things that consider like off the wall kind of things. And that's because, they're not sure, don't really have those resources to see how they can kind of handle and process that grief. So they have different ways of expressing that. So I feel like providing more resources and more just support in general for people who are dealing with grief or this prolonged grief, depression, anxiety, things like that, was focusing more on mental health in our community. I think it's very stigmatized often as well too. So shedding light on that more, letting people know it is okay that you're dealing with these certain things, and we are here. We can come together to kind of help go through it as a whole. Like you're not alone, and oftentimes many people feel that they are alone dealing with that. So I feel that social workers, we can come together more, spread more advocacy, and just be there. As mentioned, someone just to listen to, and it's a shoulder to lean on as far as being that resource for someone who else was in need. But again, that's our presentation for today, and I hope that we kind of can shed light on the racial inequality and oppression in America, within our state and local levels, and kind of see how as we as social workers kind of move towards that change.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.